November 15, 1944. A train pulled into a small Midwestern station beneath a pale autumn sky, its cars crowded with German prisoners of war. The clatter of metal wheels echoed across the quiet town, where curious civilians gathered at a distance, their breath clouding in the crisp morning air. The soldiers who stepped off the cars were not the fearsome conquerors of Europe, but weary young men, ages 19 to 30, their uniforms frayed, their eyes hollowed by months of fighting and hunger. They carried the dust of distant battlefields on their boots, but here, in the heart of America, they were strangers to everything around them: the neat white farmhouses, the broad fields now turned bare by harvest, the calm efficiency of the American guards who shepherded them toward waiting trucks. The prisoners expected the worst. For years they had been told that Americans were brutes, that capture meant humiliation, abuse, perhaps starvation. They whispered to each other in clipped German, bracing for cruelty. Some imagined barbed wire camps where food would be withheld. Others pictured backbreaking labor with little more than scraps to eat. After all, even back home in Germany, food was growing scarce. Families in Hamburg and Berlin stood in long lines for black bread and turnip soup. Soldiers at the front survived on thin rations, sometimes sharing a single potato between them. If that was what the fatherland provided its own, what would the enemy offer its captives? The trucks rumbled down a dirt road, carrying the prisoners past endless farmland. Rows of corn stubble stretched toward the horizon, barns painted bright red, silos standing tall like sentinels. For the Germans, the sight was disorienting. Their country was scarred with bomb craters and burned-out towns, while here the land seemed untouched, prosperous, almost indifferent to war. Some muttered bitterly under their breath. How could America have so much, when Germany had so little left? At last, the convoy arrived at the camp, a collection of wooden barracks behind neat rows of fencing. Guards opened the gates, barking orders in English, which many of the prisoners only half understood. The men filed in, shoulders tense, awaiting the punishment they believed was inevitable. Instead, they were led not to cells but to a mess hall. Inside, long tables stood ready, and from a serving line came the unmistakable smell of food, rich, savory, steaming. The prisoners froze, uncertain whether this was a cruel trick. Then came the trays. Metal trays, dented but clean, pressed into their hands by young American soldiers barely older than they were. Onto each tray ladles of stew were poured, chunks of beef and potato floating in thick broth. A slice of white bread followed, soft and springy, unlike the dense rye they knew at home. Alongside it came something stranger still, a rectangle of pink meat called spam, glistening with fat. And for dessert, a small cup of canned peaches, their syrup shining like liquid sunlight. The Germans stared in disbelief. One young man, no more than 20, whispered to his comrade, "Even our officers never ate like this." Another laughed bitterly, shaking his head as he tore a piece of bread and stuffed it into his mouth. His expression shifted from suspicion to astonishment. The bread was impossibly soft, sweet almost, a luxury he had never expected to taste in captivity. Others dipped their spoons into the stew, the warmth filling their mouths, chasing away the memory of cold turnips and watery cabbage soup. A few lifted the peaches to their lips, and the taste of sugar nearly broke them. One prisoner's eyes welled with tears as he whispered, "This is what victory tastes like." In that moment, something shifted. The Americans had not beaten them with sticks or starved them into submission. They had handed them food, more food than many had seen in weeks. It was nourishment, yes, but also something symbolic. Proof of abundance, a glimpse into why the war was tilting irreversibly in America's favor. The German soldiers chewed slowly, their minds wrestling with the same truth. If even a prisoner could eat like this, how could their homeland hope to defeat such a nation? The guards watched with practiced detachment, saying little. For them, it was routine, another meal, another day on duty. But for the Germans, every bite carried revelation. They compared the rations aloud, marveling that ordinary American soldiers, the ones who had captured them, ate food this rich every day. chocolate bars, coffee, white bread, peanut butter. In Germany, such items were rarities reserved for the elite or absent altogether. Even in the Wehrmacht, officers sometimes went hungry. Yet here, the enemy's lowest ranks dined better than they did. It was not only the food but the orderliness of it all that astonished them. The mess hall was clean, the portions generous, the routine efficient. The prisoners expected cruelty, but instead found a kind of dignity restored, trays handed without insult, meals eaten without fear. Some were ashamed to admit, even to themselves, that they felt gratitude. Others hardened their expressions, determined not to let kindness soften their resolve. But the contrast was undeniable. Beyond the mess hall, life in the camp would bring further surprises: music, letters, even opportunities to work in nearby fields. But in those first days, it was the meals that unsettled them most. Their hunger was sated, yet their beliefs were shaken. They had been taught that America was decadent, corrupt, a nation of weak men softened by luxury. Yet the evidence before them suggested otherwise. America's strength was not only in its weapons, but in its ability to provide, steadily, abundantly, even to those who had fought against it. That night, as the prisoners lay on their bunks, the taste of sugar and bread still on their tongues, they whispered in the dark. Some joked grimly that perhaps it was worth losing the war to eat like this. Others remained silent, losing the war to eat like this. Others remained silent, wrestling with the uncomfortable realization that their enemy's prosperity revealed a deeper truth. In the stillness, one thought lingered among them all: they had not only been captured by a nation with stronger armies, but by a nation with a way of life they could not ignore. Because what awaited them in the coming months would not merely fill their stomach. It would begin to reshape their understanding of America itself, and of the world they thought they knew. The rhythm of life inside the American prisoner of war camps soon revealed itself, and it revolved around something deceptively simple: mealtimes. The clang of the mess hall bell carried across the yard like a summons, and every man, whether 19 or 35, found his body rising instinctively, as though pulled forward by the memory of hunger. They filed into lines, boots scraping across wooden floors, the scent of cooking already teasing them with promises they still half doubted. Each tray was a revelation. Breakfast, for many, was the first shock. The Germans had been accustomed to black bread so hard it dulled knives, paired with ersatz coffee brewed from roasted barley or acorns. In the camps they were handed scrambled eggs, powdered, yes, but warm and yellow all the same, alongside slices of white bread that yielded under the press of a thumb. There was butter, or margarine at the very least, sometimes a smear of jam whose sweetness caught in their throat. And there was coffee, bitter and black, steaming from tin mugs. At first, most prisoners recoiled, gagging at its acrid strength. Yet before long they learned to temper it with sugar or canned milk, luxuries they had not seen in years. A young prisoner joked that if Americans drank this every morning, it was no wonder their soldiers marched with such energy. The line of men erupted in laughter, but beneath it lay astonishment. Lunch and dinner brought greater astonishment still. The rations were not lavish banquets, but they were steady, abundant, and astonishingly varied compared to the thin soups of wartime Germany. There were potatoes, baked, boiled, fried, served in portions so generous they almost seemed careless. There was meat, sometimes beef stew thick with vegetables, other times the infamous pink slab called spam. Many recoiled at first sight of it, calling it Fleisch ohne Tier, meat without animal. But hunger won. Soon enough, they admitted that the salty, greasy taste was strangely satisfying. Even so, jokes about spam became a fixture, and some men swore that when they returned home, they would never eat it again. But if spam drew ridicule, other items drew reverence. When chocolate appeared, wrapped in foil or pressed into ration bars, silence often fell as men unwrapped it carefully, as though opening treasure. They let the sweetness melt on their tongues, eyes closing, memories of childhood markets and forgotten birthdays stirring. Canned peaches carried a similar magic. The syrup glistened like gold in the dim mess hall light, and the fruit, soft and sweet, seemed impossibly luxurious. One prisoner, a former baker from Cologne, confessed with tears that he had not tasted fruit in 3 years. He spooned it slowly, savoring each bite as though it might be his last. The statistics confirm what the men experienced with their senses. American rations provided nearly 3,200 calories a day, carefully balanced to sustain soldiers in combat. Bread, potatoes, beans, canned meats, and occasional treats formed the core. By contrast, Germany by 1944 was buckling under Allied bombing and shortages. Civilians often scraped by on 1,200 calories a day, stretching flour with sawdust or grinding acorns to make ersatz coffee. Soldiers at the front sometimes survived on little more than black bread and thin soup. The comparison was devastating. A prisoner summed it up bitterly in his diary. "Here we eat better as captives than our brothers do as victors in the fatherland." These meals carried more than calories. They carried symbols. To the Germans, they revealed a nation with resources so vast it could afford to feed not just its own population and armies but also its enemies. Even the ordinary American soldier, they realized, ate food superior to what German officers received. It was proof of America's industrial might, of its agricultural abundance, of a system that could nourish without fear of collapse. Each bite of bread, each spoonful of stew, seemed to hammer home the truth that Germany had not only lost the war of weapons but the war of sustenance. Yet with abundance came an uncomfortable conflict. Some men felt guilt, knowing that while they filled their stomachs, their families back home endured hunger. Letters from Germany, when they arrived, spoke of empty pantries, of children fainting in schools, of mothers trading jewelry for a sack of potatoes. The contrast gnawed at them. A prisoner in Kansas whispered after one dinner, "My mother would give her life for these scraps." Another answered, "Then perhaps that is why we are here, to see what our nation denied us." Silence followed, broken only by the scrape of spoons. Still, gratitude and disbelief slowly softened suspicion. At first, the Germans eyed each meal warily, half expecting the abundance to vanish, half suspecting it was meant to trick them into docility. But the food came again and again, steady as the sunrise, until disbelief gave way to reluctant acceptance. They began to joke in the lines, to nudge each other when peanut butter appeared, a sticky paste they declared both foul and irresistible. They teased one another about gaining weight, about returning home plumper than when they had marched into battle. One even muttered that if Germany had discovered peanut butter, perhaps the war would have taken a different turn. What they could not laugh away, however, was the larger realization forming beneath these daily rituals. The food was more than sustenance. It was evidence of a system that worked, of a society that could provide not only for its own but for its enemies as well. For men who had been raised in the strict hierarchies of the Reich, where scarcity was justified as sacrifice, the equality of rations in America was startling. The guards ate the same bread and meat they did. There was no officer's table groaning with delicacies while the ranks starved. To many Germans, this equality was as shocking as the abundance itself. The mess hall became a quiet classroom. Each meal was a lesson, each portion an argument. The Germans began to see that America's strength lay not only in its weapons but in its ability to feed and clothe, to offer stability in place of desperation. One prisoner summed it up in a whispered remark to his bunkmate, "Now I see why they will win. Not because they fight harder, but because they can afford to keep fighting." And yet, for all the satisfaction of full stomachs, the conflict remained unresolved. Gratitude clashed with shame, astonishment with guilt. They laughed over Spam and marveled at chocolate, but at night the knowledge that their families starved haunted them. To be nourished in captivity while their homeland withered was a paradox almost too heavy to bear. Still, with every passing week, the paradox deepened into a revelation. Because the food, simple as it seemed, was not only filling their bodies. It was beginning to reshape their understanding of power, of dignity, of what kind of world might follow when the war ended. As weeks passed, the shock of abundance gave way to a subtler, more unsettling realization. The Americans were not merely feeding their captives, they were treating them with a measure of humanity the prisoners had not expected. At first, the Germans braced for cruelty, convinced that kindness was a mask that would eventually slip. But the mask never fell. Instead, routine revealed something even more disarming: ordinary decency. The guards were not seasoned tyrants but young men, many barely out of high school, who carried themselves with a quiet confidence rather than aggression. They barked orders when needed, but their voices lacked the venom the prisoners anticipated. Some even offered small gestures that pierced through the barbed wire of suspicion. A freckled guard whistled while serving soup, the tune light and aimless, as though he were at a county fair rather than standing over defeated enemies. At first the Germans mocked him under their breath, but soon his whistling became a familiar sound, oddly comforting in its ordinariness. In the evenings, music sometimes drifted across the camp from the American side, a harmonica, a scratchy radio playing swing, the rhythms foreign yet strangely alive. The Germans, lying on their bunks, listened with a mix of envy and curiosity. They whispered to each other that such music would be banned in Berlin as decadent, yet here it was played openly, joyfully, without shame. One prisoner admitted softly that the sound made him ache, not because it was foreign, but because it carried a kind of freedom he could not name. The transformation was not immediate. Many clung fiercely to anger, reminding each other of bombed-out cities, of families left behind in hunger. Accepting kindness from the enemy felt like betrayal. Yet the small details wore down resistance. A guard who paused to help an injured prisoner to the infirmary. Another who shared a cigarette after a long day's work detail. These gestures were not grand or deliberate, they were unthinking, human, and all the more powerful for their simplicity. Some prisoners began to see reflections of themselves in the faces of the Americans. A soldier tying his boot, another sneezing in the cold, another tucking a photograph of his family back into his jacket pocket. These moments stripped away the image of the faceless enemy. The men across the fence were not monsters but sons, brothers, husbands, ordinary in the very same way the Germans themselves were ordinary. That recognition was more destabilizing than any weapon. Letters arriving from home deepened the contrast. Families wrote of shortages, of long lines for bread, of roofs caved in from bombing raids. Mothers described children too thin for their age. Sisters confessed to fainting in classrooms. The German prisoners read these words while wiping peach syrup from their lips, while swallowing spoonfuls of stew. The guilt was sharp, but alongside it came something harder to admit: respect. Respect for a nation that could maintain such abundance not only for its own but even for its captives. It became clear that America's strength did not lie solely in its factories or its armies, but in its ability to sustain life with ease. To the Germans, this was almost incomprehensible. In their homeland, hierarchy defined everything. Officers dined well while enlisted men gnawed at crusts. In the camps, guards and prisoners ate nearly identical rations. The equality stunned them. For a few, it planted seeds of admiration that were dangerous to voice but impossible to ignore. The sense of transformation was clearest in their laughter. In the first days, jokes had been bitter, defensive. Now humor grew warmer, tinged with irony rather than anger. They mocked spam with theatrical groans, called peanut butter tank grease, teased one another about becoming fat Americans. Laughter in captivity was unexpected, almost forbidden, yet it grew more common as meals and days passed. Humor had become a bridge across bitterness, a way to survive not just physically but emotionally. Still, the change was uneven. Some men hardened, refusing to let compassion dull their resentment. They ate in silence, eyes fixed on their trays, reminding themselves of the ruins of Hamburg and Dresden. For them, abundance was not a gift but an insult, proof of imbalance that stung like salt in a wound. Yet even they could not deny the evidence before them. Full stomachs were difficult to reconcile with the image of America as a land of corruption and weakness. Reality was rewriting propaganda, one meal at a time. For those willing to see it, the lessons stretched beyond food. Work details brought prisoners into American towns, where they saw farmers with tractors, markets with shelves still stocked, children laughing in schoolyards untouched by bombs. The sheer normalcy astonished them. In Germany, war had consumed daily life. Here, it seemed life had continued almost untouched. One prisoner confessed to his bunkmate that the sight of children running freely disturbed him more than anything. "It means," he whispered, "they have a future already. What will ours be?" The emotional weight of captivity shifted from fear of punishment to fear of realization. It was easier to believe the enemy was cruel. Cruelty required no adjustment of the mind. Kindness, however, demanded reevaluation. Each tray of food, each small courtesy, each glimpse of American prosperity forced the Germans to reconsider not only their captors but their own nation. And that reevaluation was as dangerous as any weapon. Some prisoners began recording their thoughts secretly in diaries. One scrawled in pencil, "We expected the fist. Instead we found bread. Bread is worse, because it feeds the body and disarms the spirit." Another wrote, "Here I see that equality is real. Even their soldiers eat like kings, yet they are not kings. They are ordinary men who are not hungry. This is power beyond our imagination." The transformation reached its most fragile point when gratitude began to take shape. Gratitude was perilous. It threatened loyalty. It whispered of reconciliation. Yet in quiet moments, men admitted to one another that they were thankful. Thankful to eat, to sleep safely, to be seen not as beasts but as men. It did not erase their anger, but it complicated it, softened its edges, made it harder to cling to hatred. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, a German prisoner leaned against the fence, watching an American guard polish his boot. The guard noticed, looked up, and for a moment their eyes met. Neither spoke. Yet in that silence hung something undeniable: recognition. Two men, bound by war, separated by wire, yet both simply human. That recognition, more than spam or peaches, was the true nourishment of the camp. And as the weeks turned to months, the prisoners realized a truth that unsettled them more than defeat itself. They had come to know their enemy not only as conqueror, but as a mirror, showing them a vision of abundance, equality, and humanity that Germany had promised but never delivered. The greatest weapon America wielded was not the bomb or the tank. It was this revelation, hidden in plain sight, carried on trays of food and gestures of decency. And yet, the most profound shock still awaited them, one that would not come from bread or chocolate, but from what those simple gifts revealed about the future of the world they would soon return to. When the war at last came to an end and the gates of the American camps swung open, the German prisoners carried more than bundles of belongings. They carried memories, tastes, and realizations that would remain with them long after they stepped onto the ships bound for Europe. Their return was not triumphant but subdued, shadows of men who had fought for a cause that collapsed into ruin. Yet mixed with shame and uncertainty was something stranger, memories of abundance, of kindness, of a world they had not expected to glimpse in defeat. The journey home revealed the full contrast. Germany was a scarred landscape of rubble and hunger. Bombed-out cities stretched in every direction, their streets filled with children in threadbare coats scavenging for scrap. Food was scarce, rations meager, and hope nearly extinguished. Against this backdrop, the stories the returning prisoners carried seemed almost unbelievable. They spoke of bread so soft it melted in the mouth, of canned peaches sweet as summer, of chocolate bars unwrapped in silence. Some families listened with disbelief, others with bitterness. "You ate like kings," one mother snapped at her son, "while we starved." Guilt burned in many of the men. Yet beneath the guilt was recognition. They had seen a nation capable of sustaining not only itself but even its captives, and that vision could not be erased. Historians later recorded testimonies from these prisoners, many of whom admitted that their time in American camps shaped their perception of the post-war world. One recalled that the first time he tasted peanut butter, he laughed and called it glue, but years later, when jars appeared in German markets, he bought them without hesitation, remembering not the taste alone but the strange comfort it symbolized. Another confessed that the equality of American rations, guards and prisoners eating the same bread, taught him more about democracy than any political lecture could. "I learned with my stomach," he said, "that freedom has its own flavor." The American decision to treat German POWs humanely was not merely charity. It was policy, rooted in the Geneva Convention and reinforced by the strategic vision of leaders like General Dwight D. Eisenhower, who believed that demonstrating America's abundance and fairness could serve as a weapon more persuasive than bullet. It was a gamble on humanity, and for many prisoners it worked. The food became a symbol, a quiet argument about the strength of a system that did not need to starve its enemies to prove its power. Not all men were changed, of course. Some returned hardened, unwilling to let kindness soften their view of the enemy. But for countless others, the experience planted seeds that later blossomed into respect, even admiration. Many former POWs would go on to speak positively of their captivity, some even returning to the United States after the war as immigrants, farmers, or craftsmen, building lives in the very country they had once fought against. Their stories often began not with battlefields but with bread, with chocolate, with the shock of being fed by the enemy. The irony lingered. For men raised in a regime that preached sacrifice and hierarchy, the abundance of the camps was almost more devastating than defeat itself. They had believed Germany was destined to dominate because of discipline and strength, yet America had prevailed through prosperity, through its ability to nourish and sustain. That truth cut deep, yet it also inspired. It revealed that power could be measured not only in tanks and guns, but in the simple ability to ensure no one went hungry. Personal memories carried these lessons forward. Emmerich, a former prisoner from Bavaria, told his children years later about the day he tasted Coca-Cola for the first time, offered by a grinning American guard. "It was like drinking lightning," he said, his voice equal parts wonder and sorrow. Another, Karl from Hamburg, remembered that when he first bit into white bread, he realized that everything he had been told about America was incomplete. "They told us decadence made them weak," he explained. "But I saw that their decadence was strength. It was life without fear of famine." Even decades later, the stories persisted in family lore. Grandchildren heard about Spam, about peanut butter, about the harmonica music drifting across campyards at night. They laughed at the jokes but also felt the weight beneath them, the quiet awe of men who discovered humanity where they least expected it. These anecdotes became bridges between past and present, reminders that even in war, moments of decency could shape lives for generations. The broader legacy extended beyond individuals. Some historians argue that the humane treatment of German POWs in America helped lay the groundwork for reconciliation in the post-war era. When the Marshall Plan poured aid into Europe, many Germans remembered that Americans had already shown generosity in captivity. Trust, however fragile, had a foundation. Food had been the first ambassador, carrying messages of abundance, equality, and mercy across cultural and political divide. In this way, the legacy of the camps was not one of chains and punishment, but of a paradox that forced reflection. The prisoners had come to America as enemies, expecting only retribution. Instead, they left with the unsettling knowledge that their captors had revealed a vision of life that was at once enviable and humbling. For some, it was a source of shame. For others, a source of hope. But for all, it was unforgettable. The story is not merely about rations. It is about the way simple acts, serving bread, pouring coffee, handing out chocolate, can transform perspectives more deeply than speeches or propaganda. It is about the recognition that power rooted in abundance carries a different kind of authority, one that endures beyond battles. In the end, the German POWs discovered that America's strength was not only in its armies but in its tables, in its fields, in its capacity to nourish even those who had sought its destruction. And so, when we look back at those camps scattered across the American heartland, the images that linger are not of brutality but of strange, quiet revelations. Young men in tattered uniforms sitting at long tables, chewing bread with eyes wide in disbelief. Laughter echoing over Spam and peanut butter. Silent tears shed over the sweetness of canned peaches. These moments, raw and unplanned, became part of a larger legacy, the proof that sometimes victory is measured not in the ruin of enemies, but in the humanity extended toward them. Because what those prisoners carried home was not only defeat. It was the memory of a different kind of power, a power that fed them, humbled them, and showed them a truth they could never unlearn, that the taste of abundance could change the heart as surely as any weapon could change the battlefield. And even now, decades later, the question lingers in the echo of their stories. If food could alter the convictions of hardened soldiers in 1944, what else might kindness transform in a world still scarred by conflict?